You know, I asked you, would you get on the bus? When you think about the Freedom Riders of 1961, especially after the first bus in Alabama, and those students sat down and literally wrote wheels. That means that they knew that there was a possibility of them being killed. That takes a lot of courage. You know, it doesn't take a lot of courage to be violent. It takes courage to be nonviolent. It doesn't take courage to give a tip for attack. It takes courage not to. Again, making the biblical reference. We're supposed to forgive 70 times 7. It says something about turn the other cheek. Now, very few of us can actually practice that. We're only human. But at least that's what it says. But this group of 400 people ultimately were able to do that. Can you imagine like Jim Swerve, John Lewis, or any of the others that were so beaten, leaving the hospital bed and ready to go back on the battlefield? How many of us would have done that? We would have gotten our coats and said, I'm going home, I'm going home, I'm going home, I'm going home. And, you know, the excuse, and really wasn't an excuse, I'm injured. But they were injured and they still were willing to stay on that battlefield. Even to the point where when they got to Mississippi and they were placed in Parchment Prison, and they would sing songs. Whatever, you know, what was it? Take out, you know, take the mattress, take the toothbrush, take whatever. There is, in song, I don't know if you know it, but there's a neurochemical that works with song, especially in groups, and it binds you together for the cause. They were able to do that.
Hello, I'm Linda Wynn with the Tennessee Historical Commission, where I serve as Assistant Director for State Programs. I also teach at Fisk University in the Department of History and Political Science. Today I spoke at the Promised Land Club as a scholar for the Creative Equal Project. I spoke on the Freedom Rides of 1961 and brought in a lot of information about women. I started with the 19th century, where public transportation had always been a problem for women. I mentioned such women as Elizabeth Jennings, who had sued the city of New York for discrimination on public conveyances there in 1856. I also spoke about other women like Sojourner Truth, who had problems with transportation, Ida B. Wells, who sued the railroad lines in Memphis in 1892. From there we sort of moved on and came through the movement in terms of freedom rides. I spoke about cases such as the Morgan versus Virginia case, in which Irene Morgan was riding on an interstate bus through Virginia, where she was arrested. Ultimately, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund under Thurgood Marshall and William Hastie took the case all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court decided in her favor. In addition to talking about the Morgan case, I also talked about a Boynton case, which is really going to be the case that will set up the 1961 Freedom Rides. CORE is going to direct the Freedom Rides beginning in May of 1967 1961. CORE was also responsible for the Journey of Reconciliation in 1946, and they basically used the same pattern.
The Journey of Reconciliation achieved a great deal of publicity, and it was going to be the start of a long campaign of direct action by the Congress of Racial Equality. The Congress of Racial Equality also practiced nonviolence. The Congress of Racial Equality is also the same group that organized the 1961 Freedom Rising to the Deep South. And if you view the film, you know that when they come into the Deep South, Birmingham, Alabama, one of the buses was firebombed, and passengers were beaten by a white mob. Now that's what happens in 1961. But before you get to 61, I hope you're seeing that this is going along a continuous framework. Well, a young man from Howard University was trying to go back to his home in Montgomery, Alabama. His name was Bruce Boynton. By rights, based on Morgan versus Virginia, based on Browder versus Gayle, you would think that he would not have any problem. Well, Boynton was a student at Howard University. He boarded a Trailways bus going home. On a stop in Richmond, Boynton sat in the white section of the lunchroom, and he was refused to move to the colored section. He was arrested and fined for trespassing $10. Again, the NAACP takes up that case. It is ultimately won. And so Boynton versus Virginia is handed down on December the 5th. There's some common threads between Boynton's case and Morgan's case. Can anyone tell me what you think they are?
They were on a transit bus instead of a regular local bus.
They were on interstate transit. But what was the outcome in Morgan?
She didn't win.
No, she won.
She won.
And what happened?
They went back to the
CORE came in and did what? Then they called it the Journey of Reconciliation. On the Boynton case, CORE is going to come in again, and this time they're going to call it the Freedom Rides.
Okay.
Okay? That's what happens. You see the similarity between the two cases? Morgan and Boynton were both cases that dealt with interstate transit.
From looking at those two cases in between, we talked about public transportation that began in the 1900s with streetcar boycotts that took place in 27 different cities, including 4 of the major cities in Tennessee, and how blacks at that time were trying to work within the enunciated principle of separate but equal that the United States Supreme Court handed down in 1896 with its Plessy versus Ferguson decision.
So CORE decides that they're going to do what? We're going to test the Boynton case. But this time, it's going to be a mixed group, and we're going down into the Deep South. Okay? So the Freedom Ride of 1961 basically followed the pattern of the Journey of Reconciliation in 1947. Half of the riders in 1961 would go on a Greyhound bus. The other half would go on a Trailways bus. And unlike the earlier ride, as I said, they were going to go into the Deep South. They would leave Washington on May the 17th and travel through Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, on their way to New Orleans. And we know what happened if you view the film.
From looking at those cases, we asked the question, would you get on the bus? That is a very important question, because when you look at the sacrifices that 400 students made to participate in the Freedom Rides of 1961, we owe them a great debt of gratitude for the sacrifices that they made in order for us today to have public conveyances that does not discriminate against individuals.
One of the saddest stories that I've heard that was told to me by a person who was actually in the Freedom Rides. You know, we basically saw what the men were saying. We saw some of what the women were saying. But Ruby Doris Smith, who was a Freedom Rider from Atlanta, I think she was at Spelman, was in Parchman Prison. And I was told that they would take, what is the thing you scrub pots with? Brillo pads or something to that effect, and scrape her skin. And you could hear her scream. You know, when you stop and think about it, it's difficult in some ways to fathom one person's inhumanity to another person. How can a person who is supposed to be a human being treat another human being that way? I'll get to that point eventually. And the answer that I come up with, and I go back to the days of slavery, they did not consider African American human beings to start with. So it really didn't make any difference. Even though you had made some strides down through the years. What happens in Anniston, Alabama? They were attacked. They were brutally attacked. It's a wonder any of them survived. How many of you remember the little girl the lady that was talking, and I forgot her name?
The store owner's daughter.
The store owner's daughter that went out and gave water to those who were injured. That was core. Now, Nashville plays a very pivotal role with the Freedom Rides of 1961. Because after that happened, remember, Nashville had been going through the sit-ins, as many other states had. But Nashville had one of the most behaved, most refined, most deliberate groups of all the sit-ins around the country. Okay? They had been trained in nonviolence. They were trained by the Reverend James Lawson, who was a divinity student at Vanderbilt. And when I'm teaching civil rights and teaching about this particular section, I ask my students, have you ever wondered how a Diane Nash, Jim Lawson, a C.T. Vivian, John Lewis, Bernard Lafayette, all of that group ends up in Nashville in 1959, 60, all at the same time? And you have Kelly Miller Smith, and they are getting ready. They're part of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Smith organizes the Nashville Conference of Leadership Council because Kelly Miller Smith was on the board of SCLC. All of these people are here at the same time. All of the people that I just named, they eventually go out of Nashville and become leaders all over the South. When the student leaders here, and in particular Diane Nash, heard that the bus had been bombed, into action. Why could they move into action so quick? They were already organized. Sit-ins hadn't stopped in Nashville. They were still sitting in. There had been a kind of a break because you realize that Nashville became the first major southern city to desegregate its restaurants. But they were still going on. What they ultimately do, and if you know anything about the individuals in that group, they generally did and do, past and present, things by consent. They called a meeting. And I forgot how long the meeting lasts, but the ultimate decision was that they were not going to let violence overrun nonviolence. And so they were willing to take up where CORE left off because James Farmer was going to abort the riots. Diane Nash asked the question, what kind of message will that send? What was it? What did she say? What did she say?
That violence, in other words, if they would just abort the riots, then the violent people would feel that they had won, and that anytime there was a protest, that's the way they would meet it.
They would meet it with violence, and so if you run, then what? Then you're not going to get anything accomplished. Now, you know, I often have trouble with my students about nonviolence because, you know, when you talk to today's students in 2014, they will tell you, ain't no way in the world I'm going to let somebody go upside my head without striking back. Okay? National students were trained. If you've ever seen any of the films, they went through training. They went through people literally calling them the N-word and literally not reacting.
Burning them with cigarettes.
Burning them with cigarettes. Kicking, boulder punching. You know, those scenes of the sit-in students, whether you're talking about, especially on February the 27th, Walgreens, when they first met violence, you know, that sense, and I'm a trained historian, so I kind of understand what students are saying. It feels chills every time I see it. And I ask myself the question, could you have done that? And I still come up with the answer, probably not. I could have been the one that was making signs, okay? Even though you may not have been able to be on the front line, there was a lot of work in the background that needed to be done. And so that's where a lot of people were. Also, you have to understand that when you're talking about the sit-ins and the freedom rides, there are two different philosophies. One is where it's a lifestyle. People like Diane Nash, John Lewis, Bernard Lafayette, it's a lifestyle for them. They still do that till this day. Other people, it's tactical. And by tactical, I mean, to borrow a phrase from Malcolm X, by any means necessary. If that's what it takes for me to get the outcome that I want, then this is what I will do. I will be nonviolent. It's not necessarily a lifestyle. It's not necessarily an everyday practice. But it is in order to accomplish the goal.
This being Women's History Month, I thought it was very important that I highlight women in the movement. So often women are marginalized or relegated to the margin.
When we get to 1955, Rosa Parks decides that she's not going to give up her seat on the bus. Now, I'm not perpetrating this myth that Rosa Parks was old and she was tired, because that's not true. That's far from the truth. If you want to, read something about Rosa Parks, it's called Theo Harris has a relatively new book out. It's called The Rebellious Mrs. Parks. Mrs. Parks trained here in Tennessee at Highland. She was a member of the NAACP. She led the NAACP youth on protest, like to the library, because, they had a library, may not have had one, okay? And she led them on protest. So she was already radicalized, if you will. She was not this lady who was so mild and meek and so tired that she just didn't feel like getting up off that bus, okay? And if you know anything about Rosa Parks, you know that she had encountered this particular bus driver on the Cleveland Street bus more than once. Now, what you may not know is that Rosa Parks was not the first one in Montgomery, Alabama to get up off the seat, okay? You had a young girl named Claudette Colvin who refused to give up her seat. You had professors at the University at Alabama A&M who refused to give up their seats. The case that ultimately says that Montgomery must desegregate its buses, Aurelia Browder, as early as April of 1955, refused to give up her seat. Rosa Parks was not the first one. What am I demonstrating? Again, that riding on public conveyances presented a difficult task for black women. You can read any number of accounts of black women throughout the South who fought racially segregated public conveyances on transportation. Rosa Parks was not the first. But what made Rosa Parks acceptable? That's the question that you have to ask. Why had not the NAACP prior to, could have been Browder, which ultimately they did use her in the case, could have been Claudette Colvin, could have been anybody. But Rosa Parks was a member of the NAACP. Rosa Parks was considered what?
A person that belonged, that was
in-house. They knew her complete character. And in the 1950s, if you go on to court, especially trying to litigate something on the behalf of African Americans, you need somebody that can withstand that litmus test. Okay, and she was that person. Some of the other persons had some things that they had to deal with. Louise Smith was another woman who had refused to give up her seat on the bus. That was on December the 1st when Rosa Parks did it. On December the 5th, what happened? Montgomery blacks boycott the buses. Okay? It would take, that was almost a whole year's boycott. Think of how much money was lost by the transit system in Montgomery. On November the 13th, the United States Supreme Court opposed the Montgomery federal courts with Browder versus Gayle, striking down Alabama's segregation laws. Aurelia Browder was an African American civil rights activist in Montgomery, and as I told you, in 1955, in April, she had refused to give up her seat. The blacks go back to riding the bus on December the 21st, 1956, and the bus company resumes full service.